Well,
Live.
we are here. Hopefully that works. Welcome and thanks for joining. Tuesday night, we are here live at 7 o'clock on, 6:59 according to my watch, on Tuesday night. And we are glad you're joining us. If you're joining live, we do always encourage and invite questions. Use the chat box. Ask questions. Get spicy if you want. I have 5 kids and 4 of them are girls, so I'm used to spicy. Pastor Ford raised 2 girls. He's used to spicy. And you're a pastor. That's a you just invite it, man.
I told Elliot today, I said, I was talking to somebody, they were telling me I just became a Christian and now it's like everybody hates me. And I said, welcome to the club. I said, try becoming a pastor.
Yes, I actually I've got notes on stuff like that. Actually, it's observable. Okay, so tonight, the unwritten rules of growing up. I'll mention a little bit later on where this got inspired. What inspired this? But actually, I think this is an interesting topic to me personally. Not only because I'm raising kids, but recently had a conversation with somebody I know very well. And I was asking them if, they're 35 and just asking them if at 35 years old, and, when they were young, is this where they thought they would end up at 35? And their answer was actually kind of shocking, not shocking, but surprising, although I should have expected it because I know this individual. The answer was, to be honest, I didn't really think I'd make it to 35.
Yeah.
And so I think that answer is probably twofold. This is me assuming, but it's probably not just, hey, I live my life in such a way where there's a very real chance I wouldn't have made it to 35, but also the way he was raised and growing up, the idea of 35 becoming a thing one day wasn't a reality. And so the idea of growing up and getting to a point in your life where you're 35, reflecting on your 35 years of existence, wasn't a reality. It wasn't something you considered deeply. And to be honest with you, that's very similar to how I thought growing up. I was talking to my wife about this yesterday and just talking about how the idea of getting married, the idea of having kids, for me in my context, doing something for God, actually living out, some form of a destiny or, being a part of some bigger picture, a plan. It was all things that were in my mind. They happened every once in a while. They were thoughts, but the idea of connecting those thoughts with a realistic path to get there, or me actually becoming a responsible husband and father, and who's actually concerned about raising his kids right, those ideas were not even there. I never thought about that in very much detail. And to be honest with you, it wasn't.
Hey, you were raised just like I was. Only difference was I came from a non-Christian family.
Yeah, isn't that scary? But I've mentioned this quite a few times on this podcast. I work at a university, and so I've become an observer of people. I like watching people. I like listening to things people say, and to pick up on, ways of thinking and the way people process life at the college age or the university age is really, it's eye-opening. And it reminds me often of things that I thought and said when I was, that age, and I didn't go to university. So it's not a university unique thing. I think that there are some nuances to university specifically, but just the idea of growing up. And so that kind of, was all connected to the inspiration for this originally. But I was thinking about this whole thing, and I remembered a song that John Mayer wrote. And I'm going to actually read most of the lyrics, not all of them, but most of them. And he's, just keep in mind, he's 28, 29 when he's writing this. He's hit fame. And he's actually gone through quite a bit at this age as well. Tons of drama, all kinds of scandals and issues with relationships and drugs and on stuff. And he's writing this song. It's very interesting words. But just try to lock into this. If you're listening, just try to lock into the way he's thinking when he's writing this. He says, "No, I'm not colorblind. I know the world is black and white. Try to keep an open mind, but I just can't sleep on this tonight. Stop this train. I want to get off and go home again. I can't take the speed it's moving in. I know I can't, but honestly, won't somebody stop this train? Don't know how else to say it. Don't want to see my parents go. One generation's length away from fighting life out on my own. So scared of getting older, I'm only good at being young. So I play the numbers game to find a way to say that life has just begun. Had a talk with my old man. Said, help me understand. He said, turn 68. You'll renegotiate. Don't stop this train. Don't for a minute change the place you're in. And don't think I couldn't ever understand. I tried my hand, John. Honestly, we'll never stop this train." So there's a lot in those words. And like I said, he's 28, 29 writing these words. And I think it actually reflects a bit more honesty than we might consider if you're just listening to the song. You're not really thinking about the words. But what a thought to be growing up and to see how fast life is moving. And all of a sudden you're thrust into adulthood. Mm-hmm. And it happens so quick. And all of a sudden you not only are an adult, but you're now looking back a few years going, man, I've made a lot of stupid decisions. Yeah. And I'm not getting younger. I'm actually getting older. And it's to the point where the only thing I'm good at doing is being a kid. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of getting old is like intimidating. It's I'm already a failure at this point. I don't know how to process this whole growing up thing. And so, again, just this is all, I'm throwing all these ideas out on the table just to basically bring out this idea that when I was growing up, I was following, for all intents and purposes, an unwritten rule that says just do what feels good. Yeah. And that was how I was growing up. Do what feels good. Do what feels right. Do what seems best. Mm. But never really locking in until I was in my 30s, really, to an example of how to do it correctly. Yes. How to live life, how to grow up. Mm-hmm. Right? So, this is the first question, and this is just going to open up the rest of the conversation. What is the right way to grow up?
This is going to be fun. Having grown up wrong, but hitting 21 years old and getting a new start, a second chance at life. 20. I said I was going to stop doing that. 20, to be exact. I was 20 years old. And became a Christian at 20 years old. First time I'd ever heard the gospel. And after a few weeks of fighting against it, a friend of mine being very persistent, which I'm thankful for, I became a Christian, and my eyes were open to a whole new world. I mean, literally. That I didn't know existed. And the reason why I didn't know existed was because I was raised in a home that we didn't believe. But, as the years have gone on, I'm grateful, that I had that period of time without God in my life. I really am, because it helped me to have not so much a foundation, but an understanding of, well, that was all wrong. The way I was living, the things I was doing, the decisions I was making, that was all wrong. My focus, my idea, my reference points, all of those were all wrong, and brought me to that place, where I still have enough life left, plenty of life left, to right all of those bad decisions at 20 years old. And so I technically started growing up at 20, which, like you said, you're hitting 30 before you realize these decisions. And being raised in church, that's part of the problem, is that you have such a wide spectrum of watching adults, live their Christianity, all the way from total hypocrite fake to, very, very disciplined and focused and directed, and all the positive sides of what it means to be a Christian in the true sense of the term. And so you grow up seeing all this, but they all believe the same things, and so It's the reason why many people come to the conclusion that, that it doesn't matter what you do. Whatever you are is what you're magically going to become if
Yeah.
you believe.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people that believe and nothing really spectacular or even good happens to their lives, and then you have these other few people where their whole lives are made successful, and so God must just favor some people over other people, or whatever kind of conclusions you draw from that. But so I become a Christian. Well, I know all the bad decisions that I made that brought me to the place where I was. And so I realized when I became a Christian that, well, the reason why I am the way I am is because of the bad decisions I made. And the reason why I'm not like this person and other people who I was like already who were Christians, I knew why they were the way they were as well, because they had made the same mistakes I had. And they have never remedied that. They've never come out of it. These other people have made they have found the remedy. They found the cure. And so I started focusing on that, and so it was great, for me to be 20 years old with a second chance. I mean, that's exactly how I looked at it, is this is my chance to live life correctly. And so
Let me just interject
Yeah.
a question there is, what was it that made you realize that this was a second chance?
well, I woke up, as I've said many times before, I woke up the next day after praying a prayer and saying, God, if you're real, make yourself real to me and I will give you my life. And then waking up the next day, and I had no desire for sin. I had no desire. I knew what sin was. Everybody knows what sin is. We like to play the game, is a religious thing inside of us, that we like to play this game and pretend that there's certain things that we know there's sin, but they're okay. And so we don't, I understood, I knew the way I was living my life, the smoking, the drinking, the sex outside of marriage, the swearing, I knew all of that was sinful and wrong, and not, and God wasn't going to turn a blind eye to that. When if he was real, I never bought into that idea of Jesus, overlooking people's sin, from the standpoint of that, good people, are going to go to heaven and bad people are going to go to hell, because it just didn't make any sense to me that you could have people that, did some bad things wrong when our own laws don't allow for that. Our own laws don't allow, it's okay to steal, a little bit, don't worry about it. As long as you're not stealing cars, it's okay. It's,
Yeah.
that's the law doesn't work like that, and I know from personal experience of the little infractions that I ended up in a police station over, and spending the night in a jail cell because of little tiny, in my opinion, little tiny things compared to the big things that other people do. I was in a bar and I had a few drinks and I'm driving, and I'm fine though, and the cop pulls me over and I've been drinking and he arrests me and takes me in. And so I was fortunate that I didn't get a DUI because I was underage, but I realize, that, wow, people get arrested for doing little things just as much as they get arrested for doing big things. And then, hearing people try to talk about how it's okay to do little things, it's like, so what country do you live in where it's okay to do, little things wrong and get away with it? And so becoming a Christian, that's how I knew, that I had a second chance, was that I realized that I was free from all that, that I had a chance now, that I didn't have to do those little things anymore. My desires for the whole party lifestyle, which was really, the party lifestyle was just something to do. I wasn't, I had taken a year off because I was going to go to college, but I took a year off. So I got taken a year off. I'm working part-time. I've got tons of free time, and so partying was just a way of filling the time. And, but so becoming a Christian, realizing that, the mistakes that I had made, because I'd already decided when I was younger, my idea of growing up was getting married, having a family, having a good job, and living a respectable life. Well, surprise. Now here I am at 63. That's still my idea of the kind of life that we should live. That changed and then changed back, So as a little kid, I had a better understanding of how life worked than I did when I got older. And at 20 years old, I decided I'm not going to get married. I'm never going to have kids, and I'm just going to, have random girlfriends in my life, and do what I want to do, live how I want to live, be the kind of person I want to be, and work whatever kind of job I want to work. There was no more goals. I didn't have any goals. I had pretty much flushed all my goals, and so becoming a Christian, I learned, that was the wrong way of thinking, and that's what had gotten me into the situation that I was in, where my life wasn't going anywhere.
So there's get back to me. There we go. There's a it was honestly, it was just a thought that kind of rolled through my mind, but it was like it wasn't just, I've mentioned before, I have 5 kids, but it was like it was a I guess you could say it was just a reflection. I was just thinking about the type of world people are growing up in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just this idea, like the amount of exposure to what is amoral and maybe morally ambivalent or confusing is probably a good way to say it. And so, like I said, thinking about people that are just, they kind of all of a sudden they're like, there's a moment where you realize I'm an adult and I have to make decisions as an adult now. I'm not under my parents' care. And so I'm considering a lot of this from the standpoint of raising my kids and what kind of world I'm raising them in. But the idea of choices really stuck out in that flow of thought was, man, your choices matter. And so, but your choices are not just, like you use the word a lot, binary. They're not binary. It's not like it's just this choice or that choice, this choice or that's. Like, you always have option A or B on the table, and it's just, you pick one and pick the one that's right and you're good. But there's so many blurred lines between directions, and especially when you're considering the fact that a lot of people growing up lack formal direction. And I'm not talking about, having a church or, but a parent that says, hey, listen, I've learned some things. This is right. This is wrong. Even from the, we'll call it the secular perspective, it's like, hey, just do what you got to do to make money. You know what I mean? Go to school, go to university, and make sure you get a good job. And then you can start thinking about, you'll be able to support a family and all that stuff. And it's not, there's not a lot of clear cut direction in life. So how do you, again, the main question here is how to grow up the right way, is this idea of making the right choices. How, with somebody that has no direction, or maybe a history of failures, how do you, switch gears and just stop and slow down and say, okay, what's the right choice to make here? How do you, what's the thinking behind it? Obviously, it's not, you can't just say, here's the right choice here and the right choice there. But the thinking that leads you to the right choice is more.
So I want to say this because I think it's very important. It's kind of putting the end before the beginning. But I remember being in England. So I told you, I made all kinds of terrible choices. My life was a train wreck. I derailed my life from any kind of future. I had nothing. And so they literally, when I got saved, I'd hit rock bottom, and I was starting to come back up. And so I had, I was at a point where I had nothing. I had nothing to my name. Literally because I had no place to live. I was couch surfing, and so I stayed at one guy's house for a little while, and then he moved and never told me he moved, and he took all my stuff with him. And
I took your stuff.
Yeah. And so I came, and I'm looking in the window. I can see there's none of his stuff is here, but he was that kind of a person. He was a pretty free spirited kind of person. But I didn't care because I didn't have any place to put any of the stuff anyway, and it wasn't anything major. It was a little bit of clothing, and some makeshift car stereo stuff that I had set up so I could listen to music. But I mean, altogether maybe a few $100s worth of stuff, not very much. And so so I was kind of coming back up, and I had a few. I had collected some things, bought some clothes and things like that. So I had a few things, but not anything major. When I moved, actually, after I became a Christian, I moved in with some other guys, and when I moved, I literally did it in one go, with just out in my trunk. I put everything in my trunk, and so that's where I was. And then now, fast forward 10 years later of being a Christian, living as a Christian, learning to be a Christian, and doing it all correctly. I'm laying in bed, and I'm 30 years old. I'm laying in bed, and there's a whole lot of other things that have happened along the way. I've gotten a job, I've gotten an education, I've gotten a family. I'm raising children, and so all this stuff has happened over 10 years. And now I'm out pastoring in another country. So I'm laying in bed in another country, and I'm 30 years old. And I'm looking out towards the wall. It's late at night. Everybody's in bed, and I'm thinking, in that room over there are two little girls. In this room over here, there's a little boy. And behind me is a wife. And I'm the dad. And I remember thinking, cool, I'm grown up. I made it, but I'm only 30. And I've made it. I am a dad. I am successful. I'm pastoring a church. I'm living in another country. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, this is so cool. And, obviously I was very, very thankful to God for his direction and leading. But the reason why I say that is because that 10 years that I was living in England, I was making right choices for the first time in my life, but not just a right choice every now and then, and not 10 right choices and one bad choice, just nonstop right choices. And the reason is because every choice that I made was focused on the idea of, does this fit in the will of God for my life? That was every single decision. The kind of house that I rented, the location, the amount, whatever it cost, everything. I mean, everything was about, does this fit in the will of God? Will I be able to be in church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday? Will I be able to go on outreaches on Friday and Saturdays? Will I be able to, and in the nighttime, if there's a revival, be able to go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night Bible study, and so every decision that I made was always within the parameters. Am I going to be able to do these things? Because if I'm not going to be able to do these things, then I'm not going to make this decision. And that started from the time I was single through getting married and then having a family and then eventually going to pastor. And that continued on, even pastoring. While I was pastoring, make the same decisions. And even to this day, it's still the same thing. Does this fit in the will of God for my life? When I came here, so that was 30 years later. I came here, not quite 30 years, it's 20 years, probably 20 years later. I came here and I had a job opportunity. And so we were in San Francisco. The church was in San Francisco. The job was in Mill Valley. So I would have to go across the Golden Gate Bridge every day. And so I went for the interview, and they, I told them what I do. I told them I'm a pastor. I told them everything. I told them I'm not going to be able to do trade shows. I'm not working weekends. I'm not working nights. I said, if there's an emergency or something like that, I'm willing to work with that, but this is where I'm at. And they're like, yeah, no problem, no problem, no problem. Everything's going to work out. Everything's going to be fine. We'll give you everything you want. And so I accepted the job. And as I'm driving home inside, I'm feeling like this is not the right choice. This is not the right choice. And but I thought, they're giving me everything I want, but I'm thinking, yeah, but I'm going to have to go across the Golden Gate Bridge every day, and the traffic and all that. It's going to probably take me an hour and a half to get home. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, it just doesn't sit with me. And so I called my pastor and I told him, and I fully expected to hear him say, well, you got to work. And so go ahead and, you should take the job. And it was amazing because his words were, well, he said, the thing about being in the Bay Area is that a job can become a ball and chain if you're not careful. And you don't want to let this get out of hand. But he didn't tell me take it or not take it. He just told me that. And I said, yeah, you know what? That's exactly what I was thinking. I am not taking this job because I don't, I want something on this side of the bridge, so I don't have to go through all that traffic. And so that's always been the case. I've always, even to this day, the decisions that I make, in terms of what I'm going to do are always, does this fit into the will of God for my life?
Very interesting that you say that. Now that's for a second. Let's talk about, and I don't think you're putting the end before the beginning at all. Actually, it's perfect because the next thing I was going to do is read a scripture that I actually was thinking about when I was putting these notes together. But in 1 John chapter 2, in verses 13 through 17, he says, I have written. So remember, this is a just folks watching, you're not familiar with how the Bible's formatted. This is an apostle, or a preacher. He's kind of one of the I guess you could call him like a founder of the first church of that followed Jesus after Jesus died, rose again, left his disciples in charge. These disciples, he was one of the ones that started the church essentially. And so he's writing this letter that would have been read to churches. And he says, I have written to you, young men, because you are strong and the word of God abides in you and you have overcome the evil one. So he's talking about a specific people. He's not just talking to everybody. He's talking to young men who have overcome the evil one. But then he says, do not love the world or anything in it. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, or actually another translation better says the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world. The world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God remains forever. So there's a ton in that, just that one portion of the scripture. But first off, he's talking to young men. He's acknowledging the fact that young men have this strength. You're strong, and you've demonstrated it in the right way. And then he says that he warns them, don't love the world. And then he kind of like brings the the foundation of all. I know a lot of people, the exposure's changed. Things have gotten so much worse for young men and women. We're raised in a world where there's so much more exposure to sin and stuff like that. But at its very root, this has never changed. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life have been there since all the way back then, thousands of years ago. It's been the same. Yeah. And so considering all that, you're talking about, something that was like I don't want to say a predisposition is not the right word, but like a foundation for all your thinking was, is this, going to fit within the will of God for my life? Something that was leading you and something that clearly was determining your future. But what he's talking about is that it's possible to be led by something that actually is going to end your future. It's going to cut the whole thing short. So what's the difference between the two? How do you make a clear divide between those two things?
Well, like what he said is the idea of the world, the your own personal desires of the flesh, allowing those things to take precedent.
What does that mean? The lust of the flesh. What's the difference
Your
between
own
that
personal
lust of the
desires.
eyes?
It's funny because it's not, that's not talking about sin. It's talking about your personal desires, a desire for, having things, that kind of a thing. It's funny because I had, within the church, my when I was a Christian in Tucson and part of the body, there were friends of mine that they got good jobs, made money, bought things, bought houses, but I knew God wanted me to preach, and I knew this, I knew that was God's will for my life. And so I thought, I'm not going to buy a house because if I get the opportunity to go preach, I want to be able to respond. And consequently, that's exactly what happened. Is we were announced to go to England. Now we're moving to England, so we're not just moving, down the street. I moved a lot, as when I was younger, and that wasn't a big deal. And moving even with a family, you load it up in a truck and, go to the next, neighborhood and unload the truck, and you'd have people, who could help you. But, I'm, I'm going to go to England, and we did it all. We were there by August. I was announced it was the middle of July, probably the second week of July, I think, the end of the second week of July. And so 6 weeks later or so, we were maybe 7 weeks, we were in England, you know. And because I had kept myself in such a way that I would be instantly mobile if necessary. I could be deployed, like a military person. I could be deployed, and and I did, I mean, we literally were able to move everything within that period of time. I got on the phone, started making phone calls, getting stuff ready. Had all my stuff shipped in boxes. Wasn't familiar with containers at the time. I had no idea. I'd never moved overseas. I just started calling places, found a place that used plywood boxes, put all of our stuff in. They came, sealed them all, the plywood boxes, and then stuck them in something else. I can't remember what else they were in. They weren't in a container. There was some other thing that they put them in. And off they went, and ended up on, oh, that's what it was. It was in the basically the back of a truck, and a moving truck, and they just left the trailer, on the they backed the trailer into the ship, and then came on the other side and just hooked up brought the trailer to our house, and we unloaded. But I was ready to do that. But that's because I knew, But so I missed out on the opportunity to buy a house, because then after that I was 15 years overseas, and wasn't making a lot of money, and because that wasn't my focus. My focus was building the church, and so I wasn't making a lot of money. And so now here I am at 63 years old. I've never bought a house, and I don't know that I ever will be able to. I mean, it's just because pastoring isn't you don't make a lot of money as a pastor when you're doing it legitimately. If you want to play televangelist, you can soak people for money, but not being the real thing. And so, but I don't care, because I'm not going to take any of that with me anyway. And at 68 years old, as long as I have a place to rent, I'm fine. All that money you're wasting. Oh, if I sat down and talked about all the money that I wasted over 68 years of being alive, millions of dollars that I've wasted, it's all gone. Everything that I did, over the last 40 years, it doesn't exist anymore. It's all turned to ribbons. It's all in landfills. There's all kinds of waste that's been done, and it's going to be the reality when I die. Is it's all going to be a waste. The toys and things, are just, they're not anything. And so, but I will be able to, with a clear conscience, stand before God and say, I did do the will of God. And, I say this often, I probably don't need to, but, yeah, for those of you out there who are saying, well, what if you find out that it's not real? Well, number one, I'm not going to find out. Because if it's not real, I'm not going to find out anything.
Yeah.
Number two, I've lived a great life. I have no regrets. I don't, it's not a sacrifice. I discovered, save it for some other time, but I discovered that the secret to life is when you learn how to enjoy the things that you have to do, you don't need anything else. You don't need free time, because just because you have to do something doesn't mean it has to be miserable.
Yeah.
So I've learned how to enjoy, everything that I'm doing in life. And so whether it's work, pastoring, dealing with, dramas and issues in life, reversals and things like that, it all can be enjoyable, if you learn that just simply because you have to do something doesn't mean it has to be miserable. And so
Let's talk for a second about how you were raised is probably the practical way to talk about it.
I was raised well. I have to say, I was raised, when I look back, I have, I'm saying that because my mom's watching. No, I'm just kidding. It's not not really, but
I'm going to send her this link.
yeah,
Actually,
but
so be careful.
no, my parents didn't know God, but I was given a good foundation, growing up. There's a lot of things. It's funny because I used to think that a lot of things that were, in my life is like, so good. So I'm so glad that I got saved because, had I not got saved, I wouldn't have understood this or I wouldn't have understood that or the other thing. And then to come to find out that a lot of the thinking that I have, my brother, who's not a Christian, thinks exactly the same way. And I was quite surprised because it was like, wow, we were raised, pretty good. Even though we weren't raised as Christians, we were raised in a fairly, they were Christian principles, even though, because like I said, I thought, well, because I became a Christian, that's where I got these ideas, and realized that, a lot of the principles we were raised with they were Christian principles. I think it was just simply because of the time, more than anything else, because my parents were, they were, I don't know at what point you use the term old school because they were old school, but they were not old school back then. Everybody was old school back then. It's not, so I don't know how to relate it exactly, but
In
they
relation
were,
to you, everybody above you is old
yeah,
school when you're
yeah.
young.
And so no, I mean, as I was growing up, I was, all the all the parents, well, I take that back, not all the parents, but quite a number of parents were, they were fairly well, in control of their children. It wasn't like today. There's just, you have, and a lot of it's the psychobabble, that's going on today. I was listening to this book today called Flow, talking about the need for order in life, but yet, a lot of the parental teaching today is that you really need to let your kids find themselves. In other words, you need to let them live in chaos. And what a stupid idea, that, your kids are going to find themselves. He actually mentioned in the book that, that we as humans, we thrive when we can bring order to our chaos. And so the idea of having rules, growing up, or being in societies where there are rules and regulations is actually a positive thing because it helps you to have more enjoyment out of life. Because when chaos hits, okay, we need to bring this under control, rather than the idea of, what do I do? I have no idea what to do. I've never, every time there's chaos in my life, it's just, run in every direction and hope things work out. And so, but my parents taught me, they taught me order. They focused me. My dad never forced me to you're going to get an education, you're going to go to college. But at the same time, he told me, because it happened to him, he dropped out of high school. No, he didn't drop out. He finished high school, but he didn't go on to college, and he regretted it. He wished he had. And the truth is the reason why he he didn't go to college is because I was born, and my parents weren't married, and they got married, and he did the responsible thing and got a job and raised a family, and so he was doing the responsible thing. And he taught me, he said, he says, if you don't, get an education, he says, you're gonna regret it, but my attitude was, well, Dad, you didn't need it and you're amazing, so why should I go? He's brilliant, he's a genius, he's got patents and things like that, he's working for this company that he's a design engineer and stuff like that. And it's like, doesn't seem to have bothered you too terribly much not going to school. And he's like, oh no, I regret it, and he went to night school. He had to go to night school. And so I had that, I had that growing up. And so
At what point did you start valuing that?
after I became a Christian.
Really?
Yeah. So that's the thing is during the time, my dad taught me all kinds of stuff, and I was learning things, and it was cool, to know stuff and to understand stuff. And I remember moments in my high school years of, when the light would come on and things that he had taught me when I was younger, I'm That's what my dad was trying to tell me, because he would tell me all the time. He'd say, don't worry, one day you'll understand what I'm talking about, but I just want to give you the information now, but one day it's going to click and it's going to make sense to you. And it's exactly what happened when I was in high school. And so I had every intention of going to college, but I thought I'm just going to take 1 year off, and then made all kinds of dumb, stupid decisions during that time. And then, it was 3 years of chaos in my life, and not going in the right direction. And so, yeah, I didn't appreciate that until after. It was after I became a Christian, and I realized how lucky I am, thinking wise, to be able to, and even to this day, to be analytical. I know so many people that being analytical is actually, in their mind, is actually it's how to describe it. If you are analytical, then you'll never have fun in life. And that is how a lot of people feel, is that if life isn't chaos and you're figuring it out as you go along. I mean, I the number of times that people would want to do things and they have no plan whatsoever, and it would turn out to be just insane, and I'd be frustrated and vexed, and then things were done, it cost more money, time was wasted. See, everything turned out, and it's like, no, everything didn't turn out, because if this was planned before, it would have been better. This was okay, but it was, but in their mind, that's part of the fun, is when something that looks like it's going to become a disaster turns out to be okay. And it's like, yeah, but there's more to life than just being okay. It can be amazing if you just take some time to plan. And, my dad, taught me that kind of stuff when I was growing up. And it's also, it's also biblical, the idea of being somebody who is prepared. There's so many scriptures in the Bible about the lazy man, and how his life ends up, and and all that. And so, what my dad taught me and what I, saw in the scriptures, was like the two just kind of dovetailed into each other. And yeah, so I didn't have to worry about, all that. I bet had I not gotten saved, I would have walked away from all that. That's, I think, an important point to understand, is that I would have walked away from all that. So even having a good foundation, I would have walked away from it, because I was a rebel. What makes somebody a rebel is a really hard thing to describe. But I only know I was a rebel looking back. If you would have asked me if I was a rebel going forward from that point, I would have said, no, I'm just different from other people. I liked punk rock, and I liked thinking, it's hard to put all the pieces of my life together, but there was always in the back of my mind that there is a purpose to life. I just don't know what it is. There is a meaning to life, where most of my friends could care less if there was meaning. There just was not even a concern for them.
So what about the lack of foundation? I was actually thinking about this. We'd gone to San Francisco, and there was a guest speaker there, and he was talking about a whole sermon on mental health. And he mentioned the story of a man named Elijah in the Bible, who is a prophet of God. And he's, the Bible has quite a bit to say about this guy, but he, experiences this really powerful move of God. And he's the spearhead of this whole thing. And then the queen at the time, who's obviously not a believer in God, she's a idol worshiper. She basically says you're going to be executed by this time tomorrow. And so now he's running for his life. He runs for his life. He ends up by himself in the mountains, and God starts talking to him, and he asks him, "Why are you here?" And one of the things that he kind of touched on a little bit in the sermon was his reflection on how he was raised. He talked about there being, because he says, I'm no better than my fathers.
Right.
And so I kind of jotted that down as a note, because it was interesting to me. But it is something that might happen a lot to some people, is that you do something, and all of a sudden you experience maybe a personal failure, and all of a sudden you look and you're like, This is just the result of how I was raised, and there's no getting out of it. And clearly he's in the same mindset. He might as well just quit. This is who I am.
Yeah.
Clearly this is my lineage. This is where I'm going to end up, just like my father's. And so, how do you process not having a good foundation, or having predispositions towards bad decision making, or having, I've heard quite a bit of talk about inherited curses, which is something
Yeah.
I personally want to study into a little bit and find out a little bit more about. But the idea of inheriting curses, which is a very interesting concept. How do you make the right decisions when you don't have any foundation
Well,
for it?
yeah, that's the number one mistake I would say that people make is to think that that's the reason why, and it's not. It's not. Like I said, there was 3 years, okay, three literally, so 18, 19, 20, so a little over 3 years of hardcore rebellion against wisdom. I mean, I rebelled against everything. I had no intentions of going back to school. Um, I was upset because I thought I was amazing, but I couldn't hold a job, and it didn't make any sense to me. I woke up in a house with there were probably 10 people there at least. There's a queen size bed. There were 2 people sleeping in the queen size bed, and everybody else was around the thing. Somebody had paid rent at some point earlier, but nobody was paying rent anymore. We're just waiting to get kicked out. And I was part of that, and I was one of them. But I remember waking up before everybody else looking at this, and I said, these people are losers. I'm not. But yet I was exactly like them. There was no difference. We were exactly the same. But I said, they're losers. I'm out of here. I'm going to get my act together. And I went out and I got it. I literally walked in any business that I thought I might be able to get a job at. It didn't matter what it was. I walked by it and I was going to get a job. And I went to a DoubleTree hotel and I got a job, working as a busboy at the DoubleTree Hotel. It's not a great job, but it was like I'm not doing this anymore. I was stealing food, which totally in me that was like, because I was raised to not steal, and I'm stealing food, and I'm thinking this is horrible. I actually am stealing food, and actually I take that back. My friends were stealing food. I bought a loaf of bread because I could afford the loaf of bread. It was like 50 cents or something. It wasn't very expensive. And so I bought the bread. I said, I'm not buying the bread. And then they they were tearing off pieces of sandwich and throwing it at the dog. And I got ticked because I paid for that bread that you're giving to the dog. But so that's my thinking, is that I'm okay, but I'm not okay. And the reason why I'm setting this up is that when I got saved, I realized how messed up I was, how jacked up I really was. But I took responsibility for my life, and that is the most important element, is you have to take responsibility for your life. Because even if all those things are true, and even if those things are the reason why, you still have to live with the consequences of that. So you are the only one that can change those consequences. You can't just live the rest of your life, which people do, and that's the tragedy is that it's a dead end road. You never go anywhere from there. I'm a victim. I didn't have the kind of thing that other people had, growing up, and this and that and the other thing. You can't go there. And so you have to take responsibility. But getting saved, when I gave my life to Jesus and taking responsibility for who I had become, that, like I said, in 10 years, here I am, completely recovered. Not just recovered, but I don't even recognize my old life anymore. It's not even there. I'm 30 years old, and it's like I was never that person. I had outlived my old life. And the truth is I actually had outlived my old life within the first 2 years, because right away I was making decisions. Like I said, that priority on the will of God for my life, but everything in any, I got my first job after that, because I lost that job at the DoubleTree Hotel. I lost that job because of a foolish decision that I had made in my, sort of self-righteousness. And so I had to, my first job after becoming a Christian, I had to work at Burger King at 20 years old. It was like, this sucks. This is the worst ever. I've got my life together. I'm not drinking. I'm not smoking. I'm not partying anymore. How long do I have to carry this burden of being a loser? But that was the reality. Is I needed to start at the bottom, and so I did. And I fought against it a little bit, but then I gave in and worked at Burger King, and it was fantastic. It was a great job. It was probably one of the most fruitful times of my life as a Christian. I probably brought more people to church during that time working at Burger King than any other time. When I started getting better jobs, it became more difficult to bring people to church because you're in a better job, better situation that people think they don't see their need as easily. So yeah, so that's the, I think that has to be there. You have to accept responsibility for who you are, and surrendering your life to Jesus, so that God can help you to make the decisions that you need to make, the decisions of wisdom that you need to make, because nobody can teach you this stuff. They can teach you the skill set. You can get a skill set. But when it comes, it's like working a job. You can go to school and you can learn stuff at a school. But then when you start that job, you have to, your schooling doesn't help you, other than to understand the basics of what you're involved in. But you're going to have to hone your own skills. You're going to have to learn the things that you need to learn in order to be able to be successful on that job. You're going to have to grow with the job. And so that's what I had to do at 20 years old, getting saved, making that decision. I'm going to follow the will of God for my life, and I'm going to take responsibility for who I am. And so that job at Burger King was kind of I'm taking responsibility for who I am. Well, you need to work at Burger King because you're a loser. Oh, no, I'm not. Well, now you're not taking responsibility for who you are, And I had to realize, okay, start at the bottom.
What would you say is like the big difference between your motivation before, because you kind of, you've talked about this quite a bit as well, like before you became a Christian, you had already kind of started this path toward not being a loser anymore.
Not really, because there was still a few months in between. I had decided I wasn't going to drink anymore. And so I made it a week and then decided to celebrate by going to a nightclub.
And drinking.
And that night I totaled my car. So it wasn't, I was still pretty messy. And I was taking LSD and smoking pot and on all that. So it wasn't like I had turned over a new leaf. Mm-hmm. It was just, I'm not one of them. And so the only thing I had was an income, but I was still one of them.
And so what was the big, change in motivation is still kind of the question.
Well, the reason why I like to bring that part up, or where I was kind of coming back up, is because most people think that you have to get to the end of yourself. You're at the bottom before you look to religion. That somehow, people turn to religion because they have no other option. And that wasn't the case. I was coming back up, which was part of the reason why I was not open to the idea of becoming a Christian, and why, it took weeks of a friend of mine, relentlessly working on me to help me to see my need, that I needed to be saved, because, it wasn't, I need to be saved because I'm not going anywhere in life. 20 years old, I'm working at the DoubleTree Hotel, and I'm I'm clean. I'm not perfect, but I'm better off than I was, a few months ago. I still needed to be saved. So, there's just, you just have to understand that, you know, it's important to no matter where you are in life, that giving your life to Jesus is it's wisdom we don't have. No matter what you are, you could be a brain surgeon, you could be a CEO of a major Fortune 500 country company, and you still don't have the wisdom. That's why there are so many people that are, they might be successful in business, but their family is turmoil. It's, very rare that you see somebody that's able to have a truly successful business and a successful family at the same time. It's very, very rare, if at all. And, if you look into their beliefs in God really do play into it, because it's the wisdom of God that's necessary to keep, everything going.
So then, last question. What is the right way to grow up?
Well, the right way to grow up. Well, it starts with surrendering your life to Jesus. That has to be the case. You're not going to get anywhere without that. You might make a bigger circle than other people make, but it's still going to be a circle when it's all said and done. You're going to come around and you're going to realize, Jeff Bezos and the like, Elon Musk even, Donald Trump, everybody, when it comes around, at the end of the day, your relationship with God is the only thing that's going to matter at some point in your life. Nothing else is going to matter. It was sad. My father-in-law, was an atheist, died an atheist, and did well financially. He was able to amass himself a little fortune, and he was able to do whatever he wanted to do. And then his wife, my mother-in-law, became ill. She had Alzheimer's, and so they had to move into a facility, sold everything they had, liquidated everything that they had, and lived in this facility that was a very plush hospital, looking place. And one room with bedroom on either side, and a little kitchenette, a little tiny kitchenette. And they spent the last probably, 5 years or so of their lives, maybe a little bit longer. And it was like, this is it. This is how you're going out, And he had issues with his heart, and carrying a thing of oxygen everywhere that he went. He had to have an oxygen machine, little oxygen, an air pump thing. It was oxygen, but it wasn't one of those huge bottles or anything. But that was it, and we were able to fly on a private jet. We were able to rent a private jet to fly to Hudson to see the Hudson River and go down the Hudson River on a cruise. It costs a lot of money. The whole thing probably cost, thousands and thousands of dollars, and then went back to live in his tiny little apartment, with his wife, who barely remembered who anybody was. And then, she passed away, and then he probably made it another, 3 or 4 years maybe. And that was it, 19, 20, 21, 22. Yeah. So probably about 3 years or so. And, got to the point in his life where he just didn't want to live anymore. And the concern was because he had said years before that he had, thought about, the idea of, if push came to shove, that he had no problem with killing himself. He was talking about it, not from the standpoint of actually doing it. And he assured the family, no, I wouldn't do something like that. That's not going to happen. And he never went there, but that was it, you know. I mean, it's sad. I mean, it was sad. There's so many stories that I can tell about, you know, about the death of somebody who doesn't know God, and the the the, the shame, the embarrassment of things that had happened because he's old, you know, and losing the use of body functions, and you know, and sad, you know, and spent the last few months of his life in this little tiny room, you know, and like it was like a jail cell. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, it wasn't, my attitude wasn't, well, this is because you didn't become a Christian. That wasn't my attitude. My attitude was, what must it be like to have to go through this alone? You know, that you don't have any hope. You don't have any hope in a future, a destiny beyond this life. You have nothing to look forward to, and this life is, you know, over. You know, all you're doing is waiting to die. You know what it must be like, you know, to end that way. You know, and he had no, you know, his doctor was encouraging him to do physiotherapy, and he could get out of the wheelchair. And he said, what if I don't want to get out of the wheelchair? He was done. It was over. You know, he was just done, but he was still alive. And it was almost, you know, cruel is not the word that I want to use, but for him, probably very cruel. He was like, I want to die already. Let's just get this over with. You know, no, you got to live another day, and then another day after that, and another day after that. You know, and here's a guy who, you know, did well, you know, in his life. Financially, everything was planned down to the T. You know, he knew A, B, C, D, even moving into the place. You know, he's all ahead of the game, and everything in life for years and years and years of his life. He's ready. He's ready for the next thing. He's ready for what's ever going to happen. And then it gets to this point, and it's like, this is it. You know, okay, congratulations, you were ready for everything, but now here it is, and you've got nothing. You know. And so all I can say is that, you know, if you don't give your life to Jesus, whether you're going to regret it during this life or you're going to regret it at the end of your life, at some point you're going to come face to face with the reality you made the wrong choice. And that's all there is to it. And so it has to start there. And then you have to take responsibility for what you have become in the meantime. And, you know, don't play the victim. Take responsibility, and then, you know, make your decisions based on the will of God. Find out what the will of God is for your life. Why am I on this planet? What is it that God wants to do in my life and through my life? And live that out and make decisions to fulfill that destiny. And, you know, leave the growing up to itself. It will work out on its own.
Very cool. All right. That's it for tonight. It's a great place to end as well. So thanks for joining. We really do appreciate everybody who's watching live, everybody who's watching after the fact. We genuinely do appreciate the fact that you guys take the time to tune in, listen to the podcasts. Those of you that join after the fact, you guys have comments you want to throw on, feel free to use the comment section, and we will be here again next week. We do have our midweek service, and we have live events here at the church, and we do invite folks to come and be a part of those. That information will be on your screen here in a sec. But again, thanks for joining, and we'll be here again next week.